still fell back on old tropes of the necessity for law and order and strong borders, which reproduced this idea of a racial threat for which the state must secure its real citizens. And of course, we also saw this in the continual expansion of both our prison and police system, which is in reflecting many of the things that Britain's trying to do, I think, maybe consciously or unconsciously, almost catching up with the United States, but not quite. So Britain's prison population has almost doubled since the early 1990s. Our women's prison population has more than doubled, and our border our border technologies have also expanded enormously, and with a huge proliferation of often privately run so-called immigration detention centres. And so one of the other things we're really interested in are the ways in which these forms of policing in prisons are being resisted. And again, the necessity to identify how movements like Black Lives Matter, which were enormous in Britain, reflecting those movements in the United States, are thinking about responses and alternatives to these systems of racialized control and violence and exploitation. But I think need to be I think would be better understood as operating in a wider context of movements of resistance against these multiple forms of racial governance, right? The identity, the policing of the terrorist, the migrant, as well as the spectre of the inner city black criminal as well. And so it's thinking through those more material as well as political kinds of patterns and currents as well. But he wanted to really bring these kinds of arguments and these problems alive to work through their interconnections and the way in which you might potentially find a way out of them. And I probably also talked for too long, but I'll leave it there. And I'll pass on to Kojo Karam.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adam. Thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. Thank you to my other co-authors, Gargi and Nadine, and also just to really, hold up and celebrate our other co-authors who couldn't be with us today, Karem Nisanjolu, Dalia Gabral, Luke Delarona, and Sita Balani. So, it was really a wonderful experience being able to co-write with such fantastic and inspiring colleagues, as well as the wider community that also fed into this project. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the current context in which the book was completed and now has been released in relationship to the latest crisis that is now haunting the British state, the crisis of the pandemic and the political, economic and structural issues that have flowed from this particular confrontation. As has been said already by some of my other co-authors, this book is really the product of a chronology of crises that the British state has been facing, and the one that was most likely overshadowing the very formation of the book was the long aftermath of the 2016 European referendum, better known as Brexit. The way in which, as Gargi's mentioned, that unleashed a lot more of those kind of repressed ideas around empire, around nationalism, around what it means to be British, around those politics of race and nation that Britain often likes to disqualify itself from that particular history, often, in fact, by trying to contrast and hold itself in opposition to the more kind of naked racial politics that we might see in the history of the United States of America. Through Britain's history of empire, it has allowed it to a certain extent, at least within the kind of popular culture, to outsource its confrontations of race and the violence of the colonial extraction project, the system of plantation slavery, by exporting that outside of the borders of the island of Britain. Even though Britain itself was an empire, not just a nation state, it has allowed for a certain mythology of Britain being a space that does not have to wrestle with those same issues of race and violence in the way that some of the other places around the world have had to recognize. I think Brexit really put a pin in that balloon, and we saw the discourses of explicit racial demonization, of anti-migrant politics, really, really come to the surface of the political mainstream. And the shadow of 2007, 2008 economic crisis was still there. The long shadow of Britain's failure to reconcile itself with the trauma of the decline of the empire still had not really resolved itself. And on top of that, we then had the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And whilst the pandemic took our ability to write and think and share in a collective space together away from us, what it did was, in fact, accelerate a lot of the dynamics that we were already identified and were already writing about within our project. You know, there's when something as dramatic as a kind of unanticipated epidemic emerges, there can always be a bit of a panic with whatever you're working on. Is, you know, how does this reconcile with this new normal? And in terms of what COVID-19 did to the United Kingdom, I think it actually really showed us that a lot of the analysis and commentary that we were directing towards, if anything, underestimated how serious the crisis was within the United Kingdom. Um, Similar to the United States, the kind of outset of the pandemic, the UK really saw itself as amongst the most prepared countries to face this pandemic in the world. This was, you know, reports had established Britain and America as the countries that were most prepared to face the pandemic. You know, had the best healthcare system, had the best structures of kind of infection control, as well as the kind of residual logic of civilizational superiority that sees the United Kingdom and its kind of Western allies as the places that, you know, have the most efficient systems of state, have the most the highest scientific level of understanding and inquiry. There was the assumption that, you know, whatever impact this might have in China, or even when it came to Italy, this wouldn't have that kind of impact in the United Kingdom. And the first few months of the pandemic really exposed the fallacy behind this particular presumption. The United Kingdom ended up having the highest death rate in Europe, at one point the highest death rate in the world. I believe amongst 100,000 per capita, it's still the highest death rate in the world at the moment. And so the inability to be able to control the pandemic revealed some of the fallacy behind that civilizational priority, but also revealed the extent to which the British state had, in terms of its presumptions around its caring capabilities, been completely gutted, but its facilities in terms of authoritarianism, in terms of policing, in terms of control, had actually been reified and reinforced over those preceding decades. In addition to the failure to be able to control the pandemic, there was a kind of brazen contempt for the public and its welfare that was really revealed by the British state at that particular moment. This is a figure I'm not sure how much he might have translated to the United States, but one of the kind of big crisis points of Britain's pandemic response was when special advisor to the Prime Minister, a gentleman called Dominic Cummings, was exposed for breaking the kind of lockdown rules that the government were trying to enforce. You know, so Cummings might be, maybe an equivalent might be Karl Rove to George Bush. Cummings had become very prominent as really this kind of Svengali figure within Downing Street, broke the rules around the pandemic, and faced, at the least at that time, no consequences for that, and seemed to be able to essentially brush off any kind of public criticism from people who were, you know, dealing with all of the pressure of the pandemic on their own, not being able to see loved ones as they passed away, not being able to care for elderly members of their family. This failure of respect for the struggles that people were going through was really exposed by this particular incident. On top of that, there were also questions around what has become known in the United Kingdom as the chomocracy, which is essentially the dealing with the crisis of the pandemic from the government by handing out um, kind of test and trace PPE, all the kind of equipment necessary to confront the pandemic was dealt with through the distribution of lucrative contracts to friends and donors of the government. This separation in terms of the way that inequality, the way that a kind of hoarding of power and wealth by a small minority has emerged over the last decades was really exposed by the pandemic. On top of that, there was also the kind of resurgence of the politics of nationalism in order to try and mask or cover over some of these failings of the British state at this particular moment. We really saw a resurgence of the logic and the discourse of the Blitz spirit of everybody being all in together, of everybody sacrificing together, of everybody clapping for the key workers and the frontline staff. This emergence of this idea of the Blitz spirit really kind of brought into sharp focus the way in which a lot of the mythology around World War II and a lot of the mythology around the kind of even the kind of post World War II welfare state that matured out of that particular moment of crisis has really been weaponized to try and mask over the longer, darker, more violent history of empire that really sits underneath the creation of the space that we currently call the United Kingdom. The language and ideas around World War II, the Blitz, Winston Churchill, kind of then elevated itself into a full blown culture war, which is still ongoing, a way in which the government is able to try to facilitate some sort of shared narrative that can connect communities that have been completely left behind by economic globalization with those who have, through the legacy of empire and through the ability for places like the City of London to continue to be amongst the center of global capital in terms of expropriation and profiteering from the world. To tie those two communities into the same narrative has required a really ugly and quite violent culture war, which we still see ongoing today. One that is even drawing in the opposition. So this isn't just a criticism of the particular government. The Labour Party opposition particularly over the last year, has tried to rebrand itself through an explicit embrace of nationalism, an explicit embrace of the flag, an explicit embrace of this language of Britishness and the ideal British community, which of course carries with it all of its exclusions and violences along racial, colonial, and geographic borders. So the real hope is that this kind of politics of race and nation will mask the failures and the fractures within the British state. We've even seen very recently the very frontline workers that were being so clapped and celebrated in Britain at the kind of apex of the pandemic, with kind of like national mandatory NHS clapping kind of ceremonies every Thursday. They have now been rewarded for working far and beyond the call of duty, often getting sick and struggling with illness themselves, facilitating people being able to say goodbye to their loved ones online. Those medical staff have now been responded. We just found out that the nurses are essentially getting a real life pay cut for their response. They're getting a pay rise of 1%, be likely with under inflation tender being a pay cut next year. So there is a real attempt to weaponize the politics of race and nation to make up for those failures of Britain's economic standing within the world. And so we hoped in that book that we were able to shine a light on that and be able to puncture that particular narrative to a certain extent, but it's one that, of course, isn't exclusive to Britain and does have resonances with a lot of the issues that I know some of our colleagues in the United States will be facing and further afield. So with that, I would like to hear people's thoughts and people's ideas, how some of the issues we were talking about in terms of Britain might resonate with your particular experiences. And so I will conclude there and hand over the floor.
Yes, we've just invited people to put questions into chat. So you can elect as to whether you'd like us to read out those questions or whether you'd prefer us to get you to unmute and ask the questions yourselves. I think Gagi has already invited people to talk about the situation in the United States, in terms of some of the things that have been talked about over the last hour in Britain.
I think the first question I can see is a bit of a technical one, which is how the authors define racism and race in Britain, which is a bit of a difficult one, I think. But and maybe I imagine we'd all maybe have slightly different answers to that question because it's a difficult one. But I think it's interesting. I think what is maybe one thing we would all agree on is that while of course there are many racisms and Britain has many kind of many types of racism that are quite British specific. One of the things we really did want to do was think about racism and think about Britain in a very global as well as historical context. And so I guess we could maybe, broadly speaking, would define racism as, as a system of categorizing different human beings into different groups in order to exploit them differently, in order to control them differently, and in order to impose violence upon them differently in a hierarchical manner. I think that whilst there are specificities to Britain, there are certain overlaps and I think linkages with other articulations and manifestations of race and racism in other parts of the world, obviously through imperialism and colonialism. And so I think maybe the kind of concrete examples that we've drawn upon are maybe more, probably the kind of national specificities that maybe the question is getting to. And hopefully I've helped to answer the kind of more definitional bit. But Gargaga, you've written a book on it, so you're probably better than me.
No, I'm not going. I'm going to say, as I always kind of do, that the book is called Racism and the British State, but it's not a book that seeks to document and map the current state of British racism. And so what it does more is it looks at how particular articulations of racism, some of which call themselves racism, like the legitimate racism of, the kind of left behind, and some of which we're identifying as racism in some of the ways you're saying that are kind of often techniques of the powerful, because we're interested in state practice to use arbitrary classifications within and between populations to enact a greater violence on one section of the population than another. But what we're more interested in is how those kinds of expressions of racism theatricalize a certain set of moments in the crisis of the British state. So it's much more about British state is having this kind of particular, quite bizarre meltdown. And here are some episodes in it, all of which seem to be racialized. There's a bigger literature about the facts and figures of racialized dispossession in Britain, but you won't get that from our book, which I wondered if that was part of the question about how do you define race and racism. And race is absolutely an arbitrary categorization in our shared conception. I think that's one thing all 8 of us are committed to, not the idea that race springs from any pre-existing physicality, but it's an arbitrary categorization enacted through different structures of power. I'm speaking for others, hoping they'd say that that is what they'd say. And there's a great question further up about fascism and Britain.
Yeah, I can ask that myself. I'm from the Netherlands, and we would go on vacations to the UK quite regularly from the 1970s onwards. So I think I have a fairly good idea of how Britain has changed from Thatcherism onwards. And one of the things which came into stark relief is the way in which Britain always sees itself as separate from Europe. We are referred to as the continent, and a large part of this constructed identity has to do with the fact that Britain was never invaded, and they never suffered the ignominy of being invaded by another country, or not in recent memory. So for us, the war is not necessarily something which we look back at with nostalgia. I mean, I think in every Dutch family there's been rifts of one family member choosing one side and another family member choosing another side and what have you. That's definitely true for my own family. And that basically has meant that after the war was over, there was a reckoning. People were put into quite literally re-education camps and stuff like that. It was very nasty for sure. But what that has done is, of course, that no one in his right mind can look back at the war with any sort of nostalgia. And I've noticed very much that it's different for the UK, and it's this last moment in which they could express themselves as an empire, to be on the right side of the moral compass, and it's a lodestone. From television series to regular conversations with people about it, it's an identifying moment. Now, what that has masked in my mind is that Mosley, for instance, was extremely popular, the fascist leader in Britain, and there has never been this moment of reckoning which other countries have had to do, like Germany, for instance, or to a lesser extent the Netherlands, with what it means to oppress people and cart them off to camps, and what that tells you about your own culture, if you will. And similar things have happened in the UK. I mean, there was this constructed famine in India in which peasants were left to die because the food had to go to the soldiers. And that is a fascist moment. I mean, there's no two ways about it. So can you say something about not having had to reckon with the darker side of the fascist past in the UK, and how this has been allowed to bubble in the subconscious psyche, if you will, of the country, and now is coming to the fore?
I think probably both Kojo and I can speak to that, but Kojo, you go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So I was just going to respond. I think that your kind of insight into the way that World War II functions within the British psyche was really precise. And it's really become the fundamental national story of Britain in a way that I think might surprise a lot of people, even in America. A lot of people in America might be surprised at how little America's role in the Second World War even plays in the narrative of Britain stood alone. Never mind the Soviet Union or even the Empire, which, at the time, that notion, that idea of Britain standing alone against fascism wasn't even one that was used in kind of 1940. If we look at a lot of the historical work around this. David Eggson's book, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, does a really useful kind of dig through the archive on this and shows how, the speeches from King George and the other major figures always talked about the idea of the empire. Britain was still in its own mind an empire at the time of the Second World War, but subsequent to the fall of the empire that occurs after the Second World War, there is this kind of reconstitution of the British imaginary, which understands itself as this island nation that always opposes authoritarian rule elsewhere and totalitarian rule elsewhere, that it's not a totalitarian actor in the world, which the history of empire obviously points towards, but that it stands against totalitarian rule in the world, whether that be Napoleon or Waterloo, whether that be, Hitler in terms of the Battle of Britain and Dunkirk, and this idea also of it kind of being the underdog, this little island that's always stood against these much larger, much more militaristic totalitarian forces from the continent, and that's allowed for a new understanding of what the British nation is to emerge within the kind of popular consciousness, one that hasn't wrestled with those longer and ongoing histories of racial violence, colonial exploitation, and the whole legacy of empire. I think that's something that we're seeing re-emerge in this contemporary moment, both within the way that the kind of failings of the British state through COVID are being conceptualized in this idea of, the Blitz spirit, that the re-emergence of those keep calm and carry on, kind of posters, which are really popular in Britain, but again, are a complete fictitious imagination. They did not exist at the time of the Blitz. They're a recreation of what a post-World War II Britain tried to imagine the Blitz moment to be like. And I think that, that kind of fantasizing about what it would have been to be in Britain at the time of 1940 is something that really runs under a lot of British politics. Sorry, Nadine, do you want to jump in on that as well?
Can I ask a question? Hello. Can I put a question to you?
Yeah, go ahead. Yes, please.
Yeah. For my own clarification, if you look at the whole question of racism, you don't relate it to the question of class. And if we talk about the British Empire, what has happened. Formerly, they had an empire after the First World War and then the Second World War. The British Empire became subservient. It became subservient to the American Empire. Although Britain formally don't have colonies anymore, but if you look at the London Stock Exchange, and if you look that 68% of the profits coming onto the London Stock Exchange comes from the colonies, come from India, Africa, Latin America, also Europe. Although they don't have their own governor generals anymore in Africa or in India and so on, if you look at the political economy, it's still dominant. It is subservient to the United States. The United States is still the hegemonic power in the world. It is a power in decline because of the contradictions of the capitalist system. The center can't hold things together anymore. The contradiction we're seeing is part of the decline of the system, and we are also in transition to something new, into a new system where the social relations in society will have to change, where the dominance of capital dominating labor. The contradiction is the contradiction and the fight is between labor and capital, where people have to sell their labor power in order to live, and the capitalists and the bourgeoisie makes their profit by the exploitation of people's labor. Now, we must remember, we talk about austerity. Let us look at austerity in Britain. It was an ideology which they spoke about. There was no, the debt, if you look at the debt of Britain, the debt of Britain might be $2.5 trillion. But if I look at what the banking system holds, you will see it's far in excess of what in the same way like the United States. It has a debt of $23 trillion. That is the debt of the state. But if you look at the Bank of Mellon, New York, alone has $41 trillion cash on hand. If I add up all what the banking, I can go into this thing, and the whole question of austerity. Austerity for whom? There's enough money to build the hospitals, to pay people. The debt of the state is the debt that had to be paid by the citizens, by the taxpayers, by the working class, which pays substantial amount of tax. But the bourgeoisie holds the capital. They might hold it in offshore companies. The amount of profits they make are enormous, trillions of dollars. Just in the pandemic, you see, they made over 500-600 billion. So we have to relate the whole thing to the question of class, and we need to look at the political economy of the system. I don't want to go on, otherwise it will take too much of your time.
I think if we turn that over to the panel, because we've got quite a few questions to go through now. And after this one, I'll get Dan to ask his question. Who would like to take that one on board? Do you want to, Adam?
So there is a chapter in the book on political economy, and we think through questions of labour and work and how different workers are exploited differently within the current system, what we might call racial capitalism in the United States, thinking particularly through forms of emergent forms of labour, such as the gig economy, but also how certain forms of labour are devalued through systems of racialization as well. And so we do think through those questions of class and labour and political economy and consider the ways in which they're important, but always through this lens of nationalism, race and empire. And I guess the way in which we think through that is through identifying how nationalism, race and empire play a really powerful role in the reproduction of those systems of class and those systems of political economy in, as I mentioned, exploiting people differently, disciplining different workers through different forms of disciplinary regimes, and also through systems of violence and exclusion as well, whether it be through policing or the bordering of workers too. Don't know if anyone else can respond to that or if that's helpful.
Thank you, Adam.
No worries.
Anitra, do you have a list of all the questions? Because it's hard to follow them in the chat room.
Yeah. Well, we're sort of taking them down in order now. I just was aware that maybe Kojo wanted to say something extra about the class question. Was that right, or?
I think it would really be just reinforcing a lot of what Adam said. I think that there's also, the question of the role that Britain plays in the global tension between labour and capital. This is something that a lot of, like my own work, kind of tries to touch upon as well, is that I think that Britain continues to play a very specific role in the kind of network of capital relations globally. When we think about the role the City of London plays as this coordinating conductor of capital relations around the world, when we think about the roles that Britain's overseas territories play in terms of being the premier offshore kind of hoarders of wealth in tax havens of the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands or Guernsey. We think about, myself and Nadine are lawyers, and we're very familiar with the understanding of the way that Britain's the legacy of, well, not even Britain, more specifically England's common law system, its understanding of the kind of intrinsic value of property over the value of human life means that Britain is still the place where the world's capitalists will choose to argue out their court cases. And so I think there is still a real value in thinking about Britain's history as a center of empire. Even though the formal empire has declined, there is still a real value in thinking about Britain's imperial history when we're trying to wrestle with questions around capital and labor globally. It's not an either or in what we're by talking about empire, you're talking about race and nation, and you're circumventing those questions of capital and labor. I think everywhere those questions are entangled, but very much so in Britain, which through its imperial legacy continues to facilitate the domination of human beings by global capital in so many ways.
Okay, so I'm just wondering if Dan could unmute and ask the question that he wanted to ask.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for the really interesting discussion so far. I was recently revisiting this, published about 20 years ago, The Future of Multi-Ethnic Britain, report commissioned by the Runnymede Trust. Paul Gilroy, I believe it was, had some input into it. And it's really interesting because it basically argues that if Britain can't construct a kind of more inclusive narrative and identity, then we're in for some real problems. And I think really, in some ways, you can, reading it with hindsight after the Brexit referendum, you can see it almost kind of predicted what was going to happen, given that there has been a failure to really articulate any kind of positive or honest account of British history, narrative that Britain tells itself and British identity. And with the Brexit referendum, I think you can see that, and even more so perhaps with the 2019 election, which was really in many ways a kind of rerun of the Brexit referendum, that you can see there's been a lot of talk in Britain about this idea of the red wall, these seats that were voted Labour for generations in the North and the Midlands, and then all kind of flipped to the Tories in the 2019 election. And I think there's a sort of relevance of W.E.B. Du Bois's concept, the wages of whiteness here. These are towns that have had their manufacturing industry and their jobs and so on decimated over the last few decades. And really what Johnson and what Brexit offered was kind of the wages of whiteness really as compensation, or the wages of Britishness, we could say, of like, okay, yeah, you haven't got any jobs, your children have no future, but you can be proud to be British, you can be independent Brits, you can be proud, and all of the kind of supposedly Churchillian rhetoric of Johnson and so on came into play. And so I was really just wondering about whether, is it actually possible to articulate a kind of honest, positive, inclusive British national identity, or is the whole concept of Britain just too bound up with imperial chauvinism and so on? And if that's the case, can there be some sort of inclusive, honest, positive English identity, or is that even more problematic? Or is just the whole concept of national identity kind of, by its very nature, exclusive and just to be kind of jettisoned? And yeah, I just was interested in what the panel's take was on that whole issue, really. Thanks.
Who wants to take that on board? Thank you,
I can start. I mean, I think obviously it's difficult to know what you mean by a positive story about Britain's national identity. I think you don't mean a story that gives you warm, fuzzy feelings, because obviously there isn't a story of British national identity that would be both honest and give you warm, fuzzy feelings. Of course, nostalgia for empire that we've been talking about in the book and today does give some people warm fuzzy feelings, and I think we really saw that, as we were saying, around the Brexit vote. I remember doing a media interview standing outside the Houses of Parliament, and there was a kind of Brexit van going around playing sort of 1940s music, and I think for some people that would have created the sort of sense of like warm nostalgia, the halcyon days of post-war Britain, the stuff Koja was talking about around Britain sort of saving everyone from fascism, but of course an honest story would be a painful reckoning, and one that would recognize the violence, conquest, which of course isn't even over. If we look at the current context of settler colonies, if we look at places like Australia and of course the US, elsewhere, there is the violence of Britain's colonialism and the sort of extent of its tentacles are still far reaching and across the world and have its legacies. And indeed within Britain, we have a situation of internal colonies, a situation of domestic colonialism, where we see today the same or similar patterns of racial violence in the context of militarized forms of policing and its direction at racialized communities. We saw the Grenfell Tower fire a few years ago, where predominantly Muslim racialized people died in a social housing block fire after experiencing an extreme level of state abandonment and neglect. And of course, we had the Windrush scandal, which stemmed from the hostile environment, which was presented in the media at the time as this huge error and scandal that had occurred in terms of the treatment of racialized citizens who ostensibly had a right to be in Britain, but had been treated as if they didn't have a right to be in Britain and access welfare, housing, work, but it wasn't in reality an aberration. It was the norm. It was a long line in. It was an instance of racial violence, racial state violence, in a long line stemming back, of course, to empire, and so reckoning. So any kind of honest reckoning would require the acknowledgement of current racial violence that we see as having its origins in empire, which is not something to be proud of and to long for, but to recognize for the violent, murderous system of white supremacy that it was, and indeed the system and legacies of white supremacy and racism that it's left. And James Trafford, in his recent book, I think also published by Pluto, kind of calls for an end to Britain, because in the sense that we can't conceive of a Britain without understanding it as being essentially so tainted by its imperial past and its current imperial construction. And in my own work, I've argued that Britain remains the spoils of empire. Essentially, its borders, its system of bordering was a pulling up of the drawbridge in the wake of the defeat of the empire. And actually, what we have in Britain today in terms of stolen colonial wealth,
where is it?
A product of empire itself. And so I think without that reckoning, without the acknowledgement of border violence, of police violence, social housing stigma, and the violence and harm that has followed for that can be recognized as directly corresponding to Britain's imperial identity and its ongoing imperial formation in the context of thinking of it as domestic colonialism, we're not going to have the opportunity even to begin to open up and have that kind of reckoning that might seem honest. And I think when we get there doesn't seem much of Britain left that can be sort of salvaged as a positive story. But I'm fine with that. I mean, I'm personally fine with that. You know, I'd like to see where we can go from there. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Can I just quickly come in just to say that, of course, you know, we as authors and probably quite a lot of the more progressive left in Britain are fine with that. But it's still notable that in its current phase of self-destruction, the Labour Party and other parts of the electoral left, including some of the trade union movement, are endlessly obsessed with, can progressive Britishness be retrieved? What would be progressive patriotism? Keir Starmer's current leader, I guess not for long, so don't even bother to learn how to spell his name, current leader of the British Labour Party, has been advised to always be photographed with a British flag in frame. That's a quite bizarre thing for British political culture. Britain doesn't have that kind of level of flag shagging. I don't know what a more polite way of saying it is, but there is in this particular moment of crisis, including amongst the soft and central and electoral left, a return to precisely the question we're saying, an attempt to say, oh, it can't all be bad. So you're saying my gran is a racist? Oh no. And I think it's about how we have that conversation the way that Nadine has outlined. You know, well, what are we saving for what, for whom, for what purpose? And that is, I think, a little bit similar to the left in other parts of the world.
And just to add on to the brilliant responses that Nadine and Gargi just offered, I think that one thing that might not be as easily appreciated maybe outside of the UK than if you're in the UK yourself is that the reality that, as Nadine has identified in her work, of Britain being the spoils of empire, that what we understand as Britain as being a compromise that was brought together specifically to enrich the colonists of, you know, when we're thinking about the Act of the Union really is brought together by Scotland's own failed colonial project in Panama, therefore inviting it into collaboration with the English colonialists who'd already started, having colonial projects in places like Jamaica and Barbados. You know, the empire exists before Britain, and you know what we understand as Britain is the spoils of empire brought together, and with the changing of the way that Britain's empire functions around the world with decolonization, what we're seeing in Britain, and might not be as appreciative outside the world, is that, you know, it's really difficult to imagine trying to constitute a positive British nationality because Britain might not exist very shortly. The reality is that this compromise is fragmenting. You know, Scottish nationalism has been in the ascendancy for a very long time now. The Irish situation seems to also be coming back on the national scale, and so at the same time that there is this kind of insistence on, you know, leaders from across the political spectrum always waving the flag, always being flag shagger, as Draghi so eloquently described it. We're also seeing the flag that they are trying to drape themselves with represent a political compromise that may no longer be able to hold itself together with the contradictions of the contemporary world. And so, you know, that idea of that being the avenue for kind of left politics might really be a dead end for multiple different reasons, not just because of the political kind of myopias of it, but also just because of its practical impossibilities, you know. And a kind of English nationalism has also a much closer, at least what I would argue, maybe some people might dispute that, but for me, a much closer proximity with kind of explicit street fascism, you know, English Defence League, kind of hooligan ideas around kind of street, you know, racist violence, you know, so trying to recover that is also going to be very, very difficult. So, I think that there might be other avenues for political expression rather than trying to recover some sort of positive patriotism.
Ray's asked a question about what has happened to the British Commonwealth. Here in the British Commonwealth, I hear the Queen on the radio give us messages. So, you know, we exist. However, I would say that in terms of economic significance, Britain has completely collapsed. It did back decades and decades and decades ago, probably the 60s. And we wouldn't have a free trade community with the EU because our biggest trading partner is China.
Not yet. It is the EU at the moment. The EU is our biggest trading partner. The European Union, their biggest trading partner is China.
But Anitra is from Australia.
Yeah, I think it's a question of who is we here. You understand, we're in a virtual space. Most people here are not based in Britain. I now know that you are based in Britain. You've revealed yourself, Latif Parker. But before that, I did not know where in the world you were.
I am South African. I'm from South Africa.
Yeah, the question was around the British Commonwealth and where it stood today. Yeah. Then we've got a question about media. And I wondered if that was another tack that, this is Kayla.
Can I just say something about the Commonwealth? Sorry, and I'm so intrigued to know what the Queen says to you, but I think I might ask you that later privately. It's like, oh, but that's a whole different thing. I mean, I think the Commonwealth is an interesting signifier that operates oddly in Britain, because certainly, you know, this is just anecdotal, but but it's more than anecdotal, it's in the British media as well, and I was certainly told by a number of people about their older relatives that one of the myths of British self-reliance, a big part of Brexit, was saying we don't need these European foreigners who we've decided we hate now as well, even if they seem to be white, because Britain has always stood alone and the Commonwealth will save us, which kind of makes you think, you know, it's more than a silencing of empire. It's an active kind of self-delusion about what empire is. So there's, you know, that, and that was the first time for a long time that I'd heard about the Commonwealth in British political parlance, but it was such a huge generational gap, you know, so that for older people a kind of nostalgia, which is a version of Wages of Whiteness, what it was like to be an ordinary white person in Britain at the time when you can still just about have a functioning empire, even in that end of empire moment, compared to now when you're in this another near failing post-industrial state with a corrupt leadership and all this other stuff is happening. But yes, see, this I missed, and I was asking before we came online. My understanding is, although all of us missed it because why would we watch it, that the Queen gave some special broadcast today. She doesn't come out all the time now, you know, she's getting older, and they've also understood that when she comes out, it doesn't always go well. And people in the room who may not watch British stuff as much might understand that since Prince Andrew, close friend and fellow partaker of paedophile Epstein, was on television for an hour-long interview which was meant to save the monarchy thinks, maybe telly is not our best friend. But apparently she came on today to talk about the Commonwealth because of Meghan Markle. So there's still this idea that the difficulty of Britain's racist, violent past and present can be fixed through an appeal to the Commonwealth. I think that's a kind of beyond delusional, but it is culturally interesting, isn't it? That it kind of only comes in now and then in these ways. I don't know what to say about that. And I also think there's a question about wasn't there a question about whether the Commonwealth is going to expel Britain? Didn't one of you tell me that, one of my co-authors? Because that gave me a good laugh.
Yeah, wasn't collaboration with the Commonwealth in the wake of Brexit in terms of trade agreements was like dubbed by Whitehall officials as Empire 2.0, you know, and of course that kind of whole argument around, you know, the Commonwealth will save us and Brexit will make us a global Britain, it will enhance our status on the global stage, was the exact argument made for abandoning the Commonwealth and seeking to join the European Union. But suddenly leaving the European Union it was going to have the reverse effect. Of course, you know, memory is so short, even though it was really not that long ago, that the exact argument was being made for joining the European Union and leaving behind the Commonwealth, which of course was a requirement made by the European powers for allowing the UK to join the common market. But I'll leave it there on the comment.
Was there another question on the media? Is that right? Someone asked a question following the question on Commonwealth, was asking about the media, which is obviously a huge topic and something that we work through a great deal in the book for a range of different kind of case studies, thinking through questions such as the militarization of everyday life arising in Britain, but also, of course, in the United States as well. But we focus on Britain and think about the ways in which the kind of longing for an authority figure, which isn't corrupted by the inefficiencies of government or the red tape of political bureaucracy, but can simply defend the nation in its times of need, is often reproduced through various media representation, media headlines, and I guess quotes from military officials and whatnot, whether it be through the kind of militarized language that we see in relation to the war on terror, or the proposals to bring in the army to deal with forms of street crime and other kind of law and order initiatives, but more recently as well through the militarization of the dealing with the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the way in which this kind of jingoistic press always praises our boys, which is often one of the most common and popular terms for a lot of the press for British troops to support this particular war effort. And so again, you see the British press not only drawing upon kind of historic nostalgia for militarism, but also a kind of contemporary jingoism, which isn't quite as gun-ho as it is in the United States, but is certainly, I think, comparisons are perhaps useful with the ways in which it's seen these forms of militarism are seen to be an articulation of nationalism which is beyond critique, which everyone has to get behind in this quite authoritarian and for many people quite comforting way.
So we move on now to Cynthia's two questions. I think the first one is probably addressed. She'd be interested to know if in the book you are able to outline the trajectory of anti-racist movements and politics in the UK in recent decades. And the second question is that she'd like to know how you conceptualise differential forms of racialisation among people within a unified field, and using the term multiple forms of racial governance.
Two big questions.
Shall I start and the rest of you chip in? I think all
please do start,
on this, but yeah. I've forgotten the first bit. Okay, well, first, sadly, we don't do a longer history of anti-racist movements in Britain, although that is, again, one of my back burner projects that I think needs to be done while some of those older generations are around. And I know Adam was involved in a recent republishing of some of the work of Race Today that people who know something about British racism, anti-racism, will know is a very kind of formative publication about a whole range of struggles and its documentation. There's certainly a need in Britain to both accept that there has been a longer history of anti-racism and document it, because key figures, it's held like in people's garages and attics and, down the back of the bookshelf, because a country that expends so much official energy repressing the violence of racism here and elsewhere and abroad doesn't create much space for people to document how we agitate and mobilise and organise against it. So I think there's obviously a project there, but our book doesn't really contain that, because it tries to look very much at a recent set of crises with some historical back and forthing, but not how people are mobilising in the longer term. We've got some talk about very recent mobilisations against these particular eruptions of state racism. And then I've already forgotten the other part. Oh, like kind of field of governance. I'll have a go, and then everyone else in the room should try and say if I'm getting it right or how that fits. I think in different ways, but certainly my own work for a while has been influenced very much by, there's a whole range of work that tries to say, instead of saying that racism is one thing where you're either in the governing class or the racialized class, or instead of saying that racialization makes us all the same racialized being, but how racist power and violence works is by splitting populations, sometimes in arbitrary ways, like you could have been one category and then something happens and you become something else. Lots of the US-based work about how some populations become white or have a sometimes white categorization is about that. What we were trying to look at was about ways in which there are these different trajectories of violent state racism with these key figures, but they're kind of interdependent and interlocking. That doesn't mean any of them collapse into each other. It doesn't mean that what happens on the border is the same that happens in the city, that happens in the anti-radicalization moment. But there's something interconnected about how those logics of all articulated by the state and enacted by the state with some violent authority, that they kind of fit together. And if you're going to get a sense of what British state racism has been like in this moment, you need to open your intellectual flexibility a bit to be able to think of racism as a number of things at once, which are interconnected and yet distinct. And I hope now my other three friends, colleagues, family are going to help me, and I'm going to stop talking.
Well, yeah, I mean, like Gargi, I'm also interested as a legal scholar in questions of categorization as the way in which, or the principal way in which race is produced, and racialization, processes of racialization are embedded in processes of categorization. And so in my work, I look at the importance of categorization and classification in colonial processes and processes of colonial conquest, and how processes of and how law and order was so intrinsic to the maintenance of order in colonial conquests, and the role that law plays in categorizing and dividing and constructing and producing groups who are then subject to differential treatment, which makes them vulnerable, to use Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism, to premature death. So that's how I basically think about racialization and connect it with categorization, and also draw that line between colonial processes of categorization and control and the exertion of power to law's power in continuing that process of racialization and racial violence, and therefore actually allowing us to understand law, such as immigration law, as indeed being colonial violence in the way in which it produces groups who are made subject to disproportionate violence and premature death, again, to draw on Ruth Wilson Gilmore.
So will we move on to the next question? I think it's Sean's who asks, he makes a comment. In Marx's day, he pointed to the hostility of the English worker to the Irish as a form of bourgeois domination. Is the present situation similar, just the national origins have changed? So that's really a point of analysis, but then there's a more creative question around, and it's joined, what do working people in Britain have to do to reconstitute themselves as a class for itself? Gargi?
Can I start again? Sorry, I'll start, and we all have things to say about this, because all four of us and all 8 of us actually work around that kind of question. And I think that's the right question. So people should understand that our interest is in if the world is broken in these ways, what kind of politics can build us as a unified actor, or if not a unified actor, at least an actor in concert. That's the question of solidarity. Not whether or not there is race or not, but given that there seem to be forces that split us from each other, even though we are all being wounded, what would be a politics and an intellectual life that would bring us together to do the thing that we all need to survive? And I've certainly been interested in the ways in, understanding how one part of how we might do that is to make visible to a broader audience how the state operates in ways that does slice us in these ways, and what that kind of chain of fear does and how it happens. And again, I think that is not at all decided. That it's very clear in British political life that there's a huge generational divide, that even though the last general election, when the Corbyn project was really put to bed, partly put to bed by the Labour Party itself, we now know that people who worked for the Labour Party worked against electoral gains by the Corbyn-led Labour Party because they couldn't stomach it. All of that has gone away. But even in that election, which is reported far and wide, and I know reported internationally as a complete trouncing of a progressive electoral vision, if you had only allowed people under 40 to vote, the Corbyn-led Labour Party would have taken, I think, almost every seat, if not every seat. That it's that pronounced, the difference in political understanding and articulation between generations. That doesn't mean that all the old people are lost. Neither does it mean that all the young people are progressive. But it means that hold, that a certain idea of nation, empire, nostalgia, 2 world wars, 1 World Cup, that whole way of thinking about a white Britishness has a very different hold on younger people. Not least, I think, not only because younger people are nicer, although I do often think that younger people are nicer and that living in the world makes you more spoilt and broken, and that we should all, as we get older, reflect on that and try not to be so spoilt by the world, but also because the experience of being young in Britain now, as other people have said, it dissipates the wages of whiteness. What do young white people have now? Look at precarious work. Look at the collapse of any meaningful welfare in this country. Look at the collapse of almost all public services. Look at the privatization of public space. Look at the ways in which the violence of the state increasingly extends beyond those who are explicitly racialized to those who are made precarious. So a young white precariously employed person meets some of that. And also then look at the ways in which racialized boundaries are much more blurry and fluid for younger people because of where the populations are, because of who knows whom. We've known that in Britain for a while. So when they do the surveys of do you meet anyone outside your so-called racial group, for old folk, no one does. For young people, that's not so assured. So all of that together makes it, I think that's partly why the British state is in such a panic. But it does mean, the question's not answered yet. That it's not the case that there's just this juggernaut of Britishness that is going through and it's sweeping everyone out the way and everyone's on board. It's precisely the opposite of that. It's a public demonstration, kind of a pretended performance of hegemony which doesn't have the centre, that doesn't have the people. So it's all the time kind of saying, you do believe it, you do believe it, you do believe it. And I think, that's our gap, isn't it? That's our gap to play in. Doesn't mean it's decided, but it means there's a gap to play and organise in. Other people in the room have heard me say all that before, so hear other interesting things.
Yeah, I think just to add on to that, I think Gargi already kind of gestured towards it. I think the result of the kind of 2019 general election was really seen as, well, this turning of the kind of working class of Britain against the politics of Corbyn and against the politics of potential, international solidarity towards this reification of the nation. And, this is where the kind of, without being overly kind of historical materialistic about it, the kind of conceptions of the way the class functions in the current moment are yet to transition in towards the reality of the political economic landscape to the United Kingdom. The most significant kind of identity category in determining which way you voted outside of age was also whether you owned property. And so this question of, who constitutes the working class at the moment, and what the kind of changes of capital and labor around the world, the rendering of so many populations surplus to the requirements of capital to reproduce itself in the contemporary moment, even in the imperial metropole, with automation, with, the kind of transition of how capitalism functions, is creating a context in which there, like, Gargi says, there is space to play with in terms of recognizing the some of the crises that are based in terms of actually being able to reproduce your life for a lot of people here in the United Kingdom with these histories of race, empire, and coloniality globally.
We've just got 10 minutes left. So I've scanned the chat and...
Anitra, we have till 4:30. This is an event announced until 4:30.
Okay, great. So we've actually got longer than I thought, which is fantastic. So anyway, from the scanning that I've done, because there's been to and fro, and there've been some kind of like questions, I think, sort of addressed to some extent in chat, but I rely on the panelists to signal that they might like to add anything extra to any of those points. But I think the next kind of question in line, and I'll ask you, Michael, to ask a question after this one. But this is Harriet asked about, is one link between capitalism and race or empire that large fortunes still derive from the trade in enslaved people? And one could add the formation of Bank of England in that context, and the biggest strength of the United Kingdom capital or national economy in finance as the City of London. Who'd like to address that?
I think it might be worth saying that I think that while political economy is a huge component of one of the most important, perhaps, legacies of empire, and as the person asking the question mentioned, you can see these legacies through London being this kind of financial centre, and I think, and previous people have commented on the London Stock Exchange and the way in which British-based multinational corporations continue to extract resources from the formerly colonised world and exploit their labour and what have you as well. There are other things happening as well, which are political, cultural, and perhaps more abstract, which serve a very vital and perhaps less, more difficult to quantitatively measure purpose as well. And so thinking about how it is that those existing cultures of racism and nationalism seek to dehumanize racialized populations and peoples, seek to devalue their labor and the work that they carry out, seek to divide them into these different kind of categories, separating them from the so-called white working classes that have been talked about already. These systems, these kind of discursive or conceptual patterns of racism, I think, are equally as important and oil the wheels of that more kind of material exploitation that we might be more familiar with if we were thinking about political economy. And so it's thinking through the connections between those kinds of more material political economic forms of racialized divisions of labor, both within Britain domestically, but also, of course, throughout the world, and identifying how those forms of political economy are both justified and made possible through the race thinking, which is just as old as goes just as deep into colonial history as the political economy of colonialism. So I think we can better understand the kind of the messiness of the current context which the book is trying to contend with.
I think just to add on to that as well, that there's a real kind of slip of the hand in the way in which not so much Britain, but more London, and specifically the Square Mile within London's role as the kind of financial centre plays within the kind of politics of race and nation in Britain at the moment, because at the same time as a lot of the the figures within the current government, particularly those who very much committed themselves to the Brexit project, are very much invested within that kind of financial capital of the City of London. Your Jacob Rees-Moggs, your Rishi Sunaks. There has also been this kind of larger, in terms of what Adam's talking about, the kind of cultural representation of what London is, in terms of it being more diverse, in terms of it being global, in terms of being somehow other, somehow foreign, in opposition to a kind of real, authentic, salt of the earth Englishness more than anything else, but Britishness as well. And that's seen as being the kind of driving source through which the taken back of control and the recovery of sovereignty that the Brexit project tried to articulate itself through is really supposed to be anchored. And so we're seeing, it's not just simply kind of material exploitation and the kind of acceleration of wealth in London. London is also a city that in order to have that kind of globalized financial elite, has to have an army of underpaid, overexploited, often migrant workers in order to sustain itself. And the way in which the kind of racial and cultural politics of the city have allowed it to operate within the national consciousness, I think, like Adam says, shows us that there is more going on than simply those material structures of exploitation.
Any other comments on that, or will we move on to Michael's question now?
Well, Anitra, I saw that Gargi had pointed out that Katie asked a very relevant question before Adam, Nadine, and Kojo leave. So let's go to Katie, and then I'll do after. Katie, could you state your question out loud?
Yeah, sure. I hope it relates and isn't too much of a tangent, but it's just coming to this. Well, yeah, I don't know if it's a question. I'd just be really interested in hearing people's reflections about the chapter on the nostalgia for the military, because just this thing about national consciousness, I'd always thought that imperialism had meant that the state mentality and the like fondness for the state was really strong in like British people because of this. And like I see it in two ways. Like on the right, we look to the state for policing, immigration, like all these like racist, basically like implementation of like organized racism. We look to the state for that, but then on the left we have this like the Corbynism and hoping to be rescued by the state if only the right people could be running it. But I think this thing about the appeal of the army is like so much more deeply connected with imperialism, and it's kind of like this power beyond the state. And I was interested in how the army is something like in response to state failure, and that's also there in the consciousness, like that the state has been incapable of like dealing with the multiple crises. And I guess it also just links with the royal family as well, the army and the monarchy. So just like kind of just hearing more about this thing about the army and authority per se, but then also recognizing that the state is the enforcer when it comes to like specific things on immigration and stuff like that. Just be interested to hear your more reflections on this.
I think all of you three should say something, as you all have to leave very soon.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of something to say. I think there's a couple of interesting points here that we kind of pick up on in the book. One of them, of course, is the again, I've said this word a lot, jingoism, and almost obsession, cultish obsession with this thing called the poppy, which is this a little symbol that people wear on their clothing, and it's kind of mandatory if you're on television and in public office and what have you to wear one in order to commemorate people who died in past wars, but is also used as a way to garner support for contemporary forms of militarism as well. And the way in which this is considered to be, this is a way of kind of attacking sections of the left that don't consider this to be something they want to participate in. But we also, of course, see this nostalgia, I guess, for state power in a kind of harking back to the good old days of the 1960s and 70s, when there was this welfare state project where the government would say, we want to create full employment and it should be our job to provide all of these things from cradle to grave and all of this great stuff. But of course, for many people, both in Britain and in Britain's colonies, it wasn't the good old days of the 1960s and 70s. And in fact, these particular forms of welfarism were forms of discipline and forms of control, and used selectively, and of course were resourced by, partly anyway, or to a great extent, by the resources of empire. And so thinking through the ways in which both Britain, both the British state, even in its kind of quote unquote progressive leftist welfarism, is still fundamentally on the one hand linked to empire, but also is fundamentally linked to a form of domestic racial governance, are some of the ways in which we seek to, on the one hand, argue that, yes, we do need a welfare state in this moment of current crisis, but we don't want to go back to the so-called good old days of the 1960s and 70s forms of welfarism. We need something else. We need something else in the interim so that we don't all die immediately and through these multiple crises, but we also need to create and look forward to a different kind of future of mutual care and mutual aid, which doesn't rely on a British state which is not fit for the kind of freedoms and forms of humanity that we want to envisage for the world.
Yeah, not sure what else I can really add to that. I think that, that element of recognizing this kind of, the romance of the spirit of 45, as it's known in Britain, of, this construction of the welfare state. There was, number one itself also a kind of post facto creation, in terms of, there were kind of, almost kind of universal healthcare prior to the creation of the National Health Service. A lot of the elements of the welfare state, it pre-existed the Attlee government and the construction of the kind of post 1945 moment. But in terms of it being congealed into another story of Britishness, it also erases and ignores, as Adam has mentioned, the way in which the wealth of the colonies was necessarily extracted in order to actually construct the the new institutions that were being put into place, not only in terms of material, but also in terms of a lot of the individuals who were actually peopling and staffing and working in these institutions. And so that appeal, that desire for authority, for state authority, is one that transcends political allegiances often in the United Kingdom. And I think there's a real urgent need to try and push beyond that. And I think that's what we try to think of to get collectively together in some way.
Yeah, we did. And I think that one of the things we found ourselves grappling with the onset of the pandemic was a kind of realization ourselves what it might feel like to experience the desire for an authoritarian intervention, to for the state to take control and solve our problems, and call for a lockdown. And especially when living in Britain, where there was this policy of herd immunity and the government wasn't doing anything, and we could see what needed to happen, but that required a kind of strong state response. And I can remember at that point we were trying to sort of process our own emotions, our own feelings around sort of capitulating to some sort of desire, and what was happening there. And it was kind of interesting to see the trends we were sort of elaborating the book then sort of get reconstituted in our own sort of emotional responses to the pandemic, and to try to sort of sift through and sort out what was happening there, which was interesting. Yeah, I just wanted to add that because because we really saw that the calling in of the army to be involved in helping with lockdown, and just before that we'd been writing in the book about calling in the army to deal with, you know, gang crimes and other sort of crises that emerged, and also we saw the crossings on the Mediterranean of refugees, and again the army being called upon to deal with the so-called migrant crisis too, all happening over the summer as well in the UK, and so those examples kind of kept piling up.
So we move on to the next question. Sean asks, what about the history? Did you want to say something? Adam or Gagi? No, good.
Sean, I
asks,
just suspect that Adam and Nadine and Kojo might have to leave. And I'm pretty certain that Adam has another speaking engagement almost now. So it may be that people fall off. And you should just know that.
For all three of you on the way.
Thanks very much.
And we will be having a reading group at the MEP going through your book. And when we're finished, we'll invite you back for a deeper discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so we'll go back to the question. What about the history of class struggle in England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales? From the United States, writes Sean, I look at the role of English textile workers during the United States Civil War who resisted the British ruling class, whose sympathy lay with the Confederacy. Seems like the empire broke with that progressive history and continues to do so as sidekicks to the United States. So do you have any comments coming from that? Gagi, maybe?
Yeah, I mean it's tricky because we're just speaking in a room, aren't we? And clearly none of us in the room believe that there's something called the British or the English working class, which is a unified actor that is not remade through the political struggles of the moment by moment. So like we're summarising, you know, huge swathes of activity. And just I think it's worth saying again that our quite short book is trying to work out what the state is doing. It's not predetermining what the response of people might be, or how even how effective what the state is doing is, because what the state was doing was so wild in this period. It took quite a lot of our energy just to get our heads around, well, what does the state say to itself it's doing? What does it say to the population? How might you map some of that? And though we have some stuff about resistance, most of the book is, you know, it's not an ethnographic study of the many, many different ways in which this narrative of a kind of making Britain great again and through Brexit and other things, it's not looking at whether that works or not. You know, we've all pointed some ways in which we think from other evidence that is available, some of it collected through official means, indicates that it's not so uniform. You know, that what is said is not the same as the texture of everyday life. And so equally, when we look at the history of class formation in Britain and also kind of national formations within the United Kingdom, you know, it's complicated, isn't it? I don't know what more to say than that. You know, there is an anti-imperialist strand within class mobilisation in Britain and it's been since, you know, the Industrial Revolution, if not before. That has often not been the most forwarded one. That doesn't mean it's not an important strand. I think, I'm not sure if my colleagues think this, I think the reliance on stories of empire is more fragile now than any other time I've seen in my political lifetime. I'm in my 50s, so I'm kind of at the end bit. They're all young, so at the early bit. But people there's a harking to nation, but to empire, but most people don't even know what the empire is, because how Britain has mythologized its empires by silencing knowledge of it. This is different from how it, firstly, different to how it is in the so-called white Commonwealth, as Anitra has already indicated, and different to how it was even 2 or 3 generations ago in Britain, when there's all of this, your schooling is all about empire. There isn't. It's much more sporadic. The way that the mythology of the British Empire is propagated is, as people have said, through these strange kind of semi-mythic TV programs, for a bit of period drama on a Sunday night, through these, but with very little detail. And some of that, if you want to understand that, look at how little the British population understand about the relationship with Northern Ireland, what that is, how that came about, and why that might be of political difficulty when you leave the European Union. Almost complete absence of understanding, because since the Good Friday Agreement, and throughout the Troubles, the only thing that people really knew about Ireland was that they're very troubling. And then since that, it's like, wipe that out, as if that close, the most near colony, pretend that never happened. So it's difficult. It's difficult for us to then centre an allegiance to empire or an anti-imperialist sensibility as core in our mobilising, if the people we're trying to mobilise with have got such a patchy knowledge of what you're talking about. There is a huge movement in Britain about filling in that absence of knowledge, often again led by students, about why are we not learning about what the history of British Empire is and how everything else we learn is shaped by it. That movement has gone through to school teachers. It's got to the point that the British government has started to make statements about what a kind of seditious act it is to talk about decolonisation and the whole thought process about decolonial thought. But that's a battle about filling in a back history. It's not saying we all feel like proud empire bearers and you're threatening us. It's like, don't know, and people are saying we should know. So I understand where the question comes from, but I think it's not quite hitting where my sense of British consciousness is right now. People feel they lost something, but they're not quite sure what they lost. Someone says to them, maybe it's your empire. They say, maybe so, what's an empire? All of those steps need to be filled in again in our own mobilising if we're going to make the kinds of alliances that we're all talking about. And the other people in the room, like if Nadine can stay for a bit longer, Nadine's work is absolutely about this. And Nadine's book about Bordering Britain is really filling in some of that, and it's again having a huge readership because of the appetite to try and understand what Britain's relationship with the world has been.
So did you want to speak, Nadine?
I missed the crux of the question. I agree with everything that Gargi said, but I missed the crux of the question because I was trying to shift my 9:15 thing so I can stay till the end of this. I don't want it to be repeated if that's obviously been covered by Gargi, so I'm happy to move on to another question.
Okay, let's move on then. So Michael, you had another question, or we leapt over yours.
Okay, I'll be quick. Here in the U.S., we have just gone through this thing in early January, but also, I don't know how many multi-millions of people voted for the right here. And in the UK, there was a similar thing. But when you look at the charts of where people vote, and I look at Trump votes and Bojo votes as votes by those a lot of the working class that vote classes. To call us a class is kind of not very accurate because we have so many permutations in our various class formations. But the rural areas and the smaller towns is where the real strength is. And when we talk about mobilization here in the US, the UK, I assume in France, Australia, South Africa, we have this persistent rural-urban dichotomy that continues to trip us up. And I feel that we can mobilize enough strength in the large urban centers like London or I don't know, Glasgow and let's say Chicago and New York. Now, there's still tremendous racism here in the U.S., but I don't find that, but to ultimately get more strength as a unified class that is moving towards a non-racist orientation. And I've worked in many factories where there are multi-ethnicities that when they're working together are fine, but when at lunch hour, everyone sits with their own group. There's this kind of thing. But where do we go to, like, if you look at the map of the US, not just in voting, but in mobilizations against anti-racist initiatives that have come in various waves, like the busing wave, the other type of legal attempts that have been made at curtailing racism, there's this tremendous backlash. And I've said enough because there's a number of questions involved here and our time is running out. But I was hoping that Kojo and Adam could be here for this, but they're not. But Gargi and Nadine, if you have anything to say, that'd be great.
So, and you're right that, it's a shame Kojo and Adam have left, but we talked about some of this when we were writing the end of the book, and that one of the things, clearly the geography of Britain is very different from the geography of the United States, and the distances and the formations are different. And even if you live in a small town in Britain, you're still in, if it was the States, you'd be in the outer constellation of a large city because it's, much more packed and small space. But in last summer's Black Lives Matter protests in Britain, it was very notable that many very small places had vibrant protests led by very young people. Equally around climate strike, that doesn't mean that the majority of younger people, but very young actors, some of school kids, some of them are engaged in some of these things, and that. So again, I feel like there's a question mark about the towns and cities question throughout political culture. So in electoral terms, you're quite right. Britain, I think, in common with the States, perhaps more so than the States, that voting hugely increases as people get older. That there's huge underrepresentation of younger, even registered voters, and there's a huge number of people not registered to vote. So that we're not winning it on the electoral terms. But in terms of narratives and engagement, I don't feel that that's decided, because it matters for a whole set of younger people, most of whom have not even come to voting age yet or have only just come, that their political landscape is absolutely shaped by, before it was the twin crises of institutional racism and climate crisis, and now to have COVID laid on top of that. I mean, I feel like there's a whole conversation for all progressive people across the world to have now about what has COVID done to the young's belief in political institutions and mobilization at all. Because certainly in this country, it makes it seem like, well, there's no adult who knows their arse from their elbow, basically. So what does that then do to your ability to do anything and mobilize? So it's a hugely kind of anti-authoritarian push, but also such a young cynicism about the ability for any voice of authority to do anything, because look at our failure. But I think some of that was already in train. And so, Labour has been pushing the towns for a version of what Michael has been saying, as if, oh, well, people who live in cities, even if they've got no money and they've got insecure work, they're all these kind of metropolitan elites because they know people from other ethnicities and they drink coffee. And it's the people in the towns that, but that's, I think the generational issue, again, blurs that. You can hear, I always think it's not decided. It's decided by what we do together, isn't it? That has to be our job. What can we understand together, and how does that make us decide what we then do together?
Nadine?
Yeah, just to say, I agree with Gargi, and I think that a lot of what you're saying is it was already in train with the climate strike in terms of young people's kind of loss of faith in the ability of adults to take seriously the future of the planet, and that means their future too. And I think we've seen a massive movement towards that sort of mistrust of adults already very strongly in place globally. I'm not, of course, just talking about Britain, but globally, which then I think, as Gargi was saying, the pandemic has really solidified with huge justification, I think. Yeah.
About half an hour ago, Sean, you put in a few questions, and I think some of them have been addressed to some extent in chat and in the discussion. Is there anything extra that you'd like to ask, if you'd like to unmute yourself, in terms of, yeah, the questions that you had?
No, I appreciate the comments of the speakers. It's a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.